Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Trust that you had a good night's sleep, and you guys are waking up to enjoy another day. Today is Wednesday, December the 14th. We get an opportunity to sit together and open up the Word, and for that, I am always grateful. Great way to start the day when our first thoughts are on Him, on this life that He's been given, and responsibilities that we have to live this out in the world in which we find ourselves now. You know, can you believe it's going to be a week from some Sundays, Christmas already? There's a lot of activity all around. I trust that you're way ahead on all of your shopping, trying to whittle down those lists and get everything wrapped and ready. This particular Advent season, we're looking at a theme called God's People Living Generously. And with God's People Living Generously, we have taken as a model the story of the Incarnation. Because in that story, we saw this theme of generosity being worked out. Just to give a little recap here, right? That generosity really starts at the heart of God. I mean, that famous verse, John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That gift of life comes from a God who is moved by love for a world that is broken. And what does God do? He gives his most treasured possession. He gives his Son to save the world, right? To redeem this world. And Jesus then comes, and Jesus lays down his life. He can't give any more than that. He says, I have come that you might have life and have it abundant. We saw in the characters in the whole incarnation story of Mary giving up her future. Everything that she may have dreamed about as a child, now, with the coming of this promise, she was chosen to give birth to this Savior, and it changed the whole the whole projection of her life. And it's the same thing with Joseph. He lays down his reputation, the shepherds their time, the magi their money. And so we took a look at, in Luke chapter 16, we looked at a passage of Jesus speaking about the dishonest manager. And the dishonest manager does something upon learning that he's going to be dismissed from his responsibilities. He goes out and he begins to, make agreements with his master's debtors, all of which to make life easier for him. Right? He's trying to find a soft landing after being let go. And the curious thing is that in the parable that Jesus is telling, he says that the master commends the dishonest manager for being shrewd. And then Jesus offers this commentary. In Luke 16, verse 9, he says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. See, the commendation of the man who is shrewd, Jesus says, is because the people of people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own than the people of the light. And he drew a contrast between those who are consumed with life in this world without really thinking about this life that is to come. The children of the light are now those whose eyes have been opened, who are becoming more and more aware of the kingdom of heaven and how it is encroaching upon one another's life. So, in this text, then, what we begin to see is Jesus is then commending to us that we don't use worldly wealth the way the people of the world use it, right? but we use it to gain friends for what reason? So that when it's gone, we would be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So the whole purpose then is to remind us that we have a responsibility to live out these kingdom principles in a way that at the end of this life, this true life is going to be, will be ours. So when you look now at verses 10 through 12, Jesus begins to give us a little bit more of a commentary on what that's all about. He says to us, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and he asked him, what is this that I hear about you, right? And he says, because give an account, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Well, in verses 10 through 12, what we discover in this passage is Jesus now looks at the qualities of what it means to be a good manager. What makes a manager trustworthy? And he says here, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So as you looked at this passage in verses 10 to 12, this theme again, right, of being a good manager, one who is using the resources that God has given to us for eternal purposes, that we are seeking to use this wealth to influence others so that they may make those same decisions that could affect their eternity. Think about that. Our everyday life then can have a consequence in someone else's life for their eternity. That's what these verses are teaching us. It's teaching us to live life generously with the view that we'll be influencing people in this world to come, not only in the present, right? So when we took a look at this text, we began to realize that there is this issue of character. You want to make sure that you're being faithful with a little, because then you can be trusted with much. Consequently, Jesus says if you show yourself to be dishonest in a little, you're going to be dishonest with a lot. So this is all about the transformation of a person's heart. It always deals with what's going on inside of us and how we approach, the responsibilities that are before us, how we begin to dispense with the resources that God brings to us. Are we using them for kingdom purposes or really just to serve ourselves? Now, it doesn't have to be a one or the other, right? Like you go out to make a living so you can provide a good means for your family. You provide your children with good gifts, and so does our Heavenly Father with us. It's just that can't stop just with us. The gifts that God pours out on His church, for instance, is meant for the common good, so that we might demonstrate whatever those gifts that God has poured out to us in a way that's helping to come alongside and minister to the world around us. And always with the idea that we're going to use this influence to influence people for eternity. Now, what's interesting about this text is this idea of little and much. Because then in verse 11, he says, so if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who's going to trust you with true riches? So just like we went from little to much, it seems like worldly wealth is inferior to true riches. So this idea of little is really the way in which now Jesus is talking about being trustworthy in handling a little seems to be handling worldly wealth. Whereas if you have been given much, if you can be trusted with much, that much is now true riches. We took a look at yesterday at Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says that we have to lay up for ourselves treasures not on earth, right, where moth and rust can destroy and thieves can break in and steal, but we want to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust can can destroy, or thieves can break in and steal. And so in that regard, now we are being asked, okay, what is this going to look like in this whole scenario then of worldly wealth or the wealth of this world and true riches? Jesus says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, because in doing so, it says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? And so then now you begin to realize, oh, there is a distinction then between laying up treasures on earth and laying treasures up in heaven. Well, what does that mean then? That if we're going to look at this, what will that mean for the way in which we are engaging the resources and the responsibilities we have here? I would suggest that what the difference is between laying up treasures for yourself on earth over against laying up treasures in heaven is the way in which we are engaging the world in a way that demonstrates that we care about what God cares about. That very often, if it's just using it for ourselves, like this dishonest manager, well, he could be shrewd in the way in which he's making a better life for himself in the present, but you do realize that it's at the expense of cheating his master. It's about provoking other people to engage in his lies and his schemes. So everybody is scheming just for their own personal advancement and comfort. But kingdom principles is something that God is saying, when you involve yourself in this work, you're demonstrating that you're storing up treasures in heaven because you're mindful of what God really cares about. And this is something then that I think God is also asking you and me to do, because as we continue in this work, right? We find ourselves I'm thinking now of this of another parable where Jesus talks about a rich man who goes out and has a bumper crop. And when he has this bumper crop, he brings it in, and he recognizes as he gathers it that he doesn't have enough room in his barns for this crop. So he tears down his barns and he builds bigger barns. And in the building of the bigger barns, he puts away all this harvest, and then he says to himself, he says, "Soul, take thine ease," because he has gathered in such an abundance that he thinks his life is going to be now just really taken care of. Like there isn't going to be any more challenges for him. His future is secure. And then Jesus turns and calls him a fool. He calls him a fool because he says he drew the wrong conclusions. Like, for instance, he thought that all that he had just finished, collecting was something that he was going to be spending on himself. And the truth of the matter is, Jesus says, today your life is going to be required of you. He says you should have been rich in the things of God. But he was looking at all those resources as making a secure future for him, and as almost a way of saying, like, hey, life is going to be good, and I'm not too worried about what's coming. Well, that's a pretty short-sighted way, because Jesus is saying to you and me that the resources that we have is no guarantee that we're going to have a long life. The fact that you have many resources is not a guarantee against trouble or persecution. And so to build one's life simply on a foundation of plenty is not going to be enough. It's in fact, sometimes the more you have, the more complicated life gets. You begin to realize, the influence that comes with that kind of abundance, responsibility that comes with that kind of abundance, and it has a way of sometimes, just eating away at a foundation of one's life. And poverty could do the same, right? Just because you have a lot doesn't place you in a poor, in a less positive position than someone who has little, because the person who has little, that's all they think about. They can't get beyond, the need of the moment. But in this context of living generously, this dishonest manager was utilizing resources so that his future would be more comfortable. And that was the extent of it. God is asking us now to use resources in a way that makes us mindful of the future, and also to use that influence for eternal purposes. Because the course of our life is going to be determined also about the way in which we are managing the things of this world. That's why when you look at this passage, and Jesus says, if you can't be trusted, in handling worldly wealth, who's going to trust you with true riches? So the true riches are those things that belong to this kingdom of heaven. And haven't we begun to already appreciate more and more of what God has been telling us about that? About making certain that you and I are hearing these words that he's been teaching us, and we're beginning to put them into practice. Because that's what makes the foundation of one's life strong. So that when the challenges of life come, and we find them confronting us on multiple levels, we're able to stand because we have been building on these eternal values. It's not as fickle as the changing environment that we find ourselves in this culture. That's one of the most difficult things I believe that we find now living in this day, is that, boy, the pendulum swings so much. What's popular now comes out of vogue, and then something else is popular. And the next thing you know, if you're just riding along in that current, boy, you're going to find yourself way down, in places you never thought you'd travel. Jesus is trying to give us these anchors, secure places on which to build one's life. And one of the things that he's trying to teach us here in this parable of the dishonest manager is to make sure that we have front and center this idea that life is more broadly defined, not just by the number of days we have in this life, but also by eternity. And so when you begin to look at your life through that lens, then you begin to recognize that there is a responsibility to act in the present in a way that's going to welcome me into these eternal dwellings. It makes it puts this burden on me to make certain that I'm acting in a trustworthy manner in the exercise of the responsibilities that I have, because God is watching. We looked at yesterday a passage in Matthew chapter 6 where the constant refrain is that when you do your acts of righteousness, when you give to the needy, when you pray, right, when whatever those acts of charity are, Jesus says, don't do them to be seen by men, for then you will receive your reward. The applause of men, right? The honor they give you, like whatever that is, that's the extent of that reward. Jesus says, no, we ought to do it for the audience of one, for a God who sees in secret and who will reward you. And that reward comes how? By welcoming you into eternal dwellings. It's an entirely different way of living, isn't it? Now, notice what it says here in verse 12. In verse 12, he says, if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Now, look at that text, because it seems to be in reverse, right? In other words, if you have proven yourself to be, trustworthy with your own property, maybe someone might give you their property to manage. But this text has it in reverse. It says, if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? And so in the parable, that dishonest manager was not trustworthy with his master's property. So in this context, don't you see that Jesus is saying, basically the resources and everything that we have, they don't belong to you. They belong to God. God is the one who has given you every good and perfect gift. God is the one that has poured out his gifts and resources so that we might honor him in the way in which we discharge them. So this idea then that all that we have is really managing God's resources. Now all of a sudden, don't you see that sheds a whole nother light on what this parable is teaching, because it's saying to you and me, we have to demonstrate a faithfulness in how we're handling God's things, so that when the day comes and we find ourselves now entering into this kingdom of heaven, we will receive property of our own, because we have shown ourselves to be trustworthy. That you could be welcomed into the kingdom that has been prepared for you. That Jesus says, "Come, I'm preparing a place for you, so that where I am, there you would be also." Do you understand then how all of these things come together? This is like the run through for what's going to happen in heaven. If we have to show ourselves to be faithful now in a little, so that we're giving the much of the kingdom. We have to show ourselves faithful in handling the wealth of this world, so that we can find ourselves trustworthy with the riches of heaven. We are to be trustworthy with someone else's property, with God's property, while we're here in this life, so that at the end of this life, we would receive property of our own. You see, it's always going from the lesser to the greater. That's a common theme oftentimes throughout the scriptures. But this parable of the dishonest manager is laying it out pretty clearly, that we are being called upon to manage one's life and resources from God's perspective. And if we're going to inherit true riches, if we're going to receive property of our own, it's always going to be determined on how well we're handling the worldly riches that God has poured out into our life now. So the challenge then is to be faithful with the little so that we would find ourselves to be trustworthy with much, that we would be given greater responsibilities, greater resources. When's the last time that you think about that in terms of your everyday life? Living in a way that is demonstrating a generosity that comes from the heart, where you're just mindful of ways in which you could come alongside people and share with them something of this kingdom, not just in words, but in our actions. A note of support, a call of encouragement, helping someone with some mundane tasks that need to happen, just showing a kindness and a gentleness that oftentimes is all that people need to get them to think about, their relationship with God and their future. That's what we're being asked to do now. And we'll look at the rest of this parable and its interpretation tomorrow. But that's a good place to stop today. It's just to think we are being asked to manage God's resources so that the day will come when we would receive the resources of our own and entrance into his kingdom where he promises everything good. I don't know about you, but that's kind of appealing. I am looking forward to that day when all things will be made new. I want to be a part of that. And what Jesus is saying is it begins now. Live generously with God's resources so that we make friends for ourselves. Because when it's gone, you want to make sure that you're welcomed into eternal dwellings. Well, my friends, you go out today, you seize the day. And I do hope that we do this every day, just mindful that God is good all the time. God bless you. Looking forward to tomorrow, Lord willing, and we'll continue our study on living generously. God bless.